What's up, everyone? Welcome back. This past Monday, boxer Anthony Joshua found himself in a terrible car wreck near Lagos, Nigeria, which resulted in not only his own injuries, but also the death of two of his trainers. Today, we're going to look at how this event was a numerical riddle connected to Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner in the United States. It's actually a perfect double riddle, as we'll also examine how this all connects to the Skull and Bones Code, the secret society located at Yale University. Now, this crash came at interesting timing for Anthony Joshua, as it's very likely that you or someone you know just watched Anthony Joshua fight on Netflix 10 days before the crash, as he took part in what was certainly his largest payday in a bout against famous social media influencer Jake Paul. Now, the driver has just been charged in this, and we'll look at this guy also, a 46-year-old named Adeniyi Coyote. But to start things off, we need to look at how this all connects to the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, before I continue, I am aware that there was some pretty big news developing last night as the United States invaded Venezuela, capturing the leader of the country, President Nicolas Maduro. And there are a couple of similar numbers in these stories, but that decode is something I'll be looking at after this video. So let's kick this off and explain how all roads lead to Rome. As once again, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner was named Francis Scott Key. Last year, a man named Robert Francis Prevost from the United States became the new Pope of the Catholic Church, replacing the first ever Pope who used the papal name Francis. Back in March of last year, a bridge named after Francis Scott Key in Baltimore, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written, suddenly collapsed after a shipping vessel struck one of its support beams. So we'll talk about how this event is also numerically connected. For starters, in the large number triangular number cipher, notice how the name Anthony Joshua has matching 1,535 gematria with Star-Spangled Banner. And the type of car he was riding in, a Lexus, has matching 1,547 gematria with the name Francis Scott Key. But let's next look at the alignment that really pointed me to this riddle in the first place. And once again, this is all connected to the United States, where Anthony Joshua just was to fight Jake Paul for, like I said, his biggest payday in his career. Anthony Joshua was born on October 15th of 1989. Measuring all the way back to Independence Day of the United States in 1776, he was born 77,900 days after America's founding. This number 779 points us to the Star-Spangled Banner. And in the language of Gematria, using the Latin method, which I consider to be the most significant cipher, the Star-Spangled Banner equals 779. Using square numbers, the author of the song, Francis Key, notice how his name equals 1779 with square numbers. Well, that's pretty important because Key was born in the year 1779. Key shares a name, Francis, with the new American Pope. And it's quite perfect because the new American Pope was born on September 14th. Well, September 14th is the date in history that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. 2 days after Anthony Joshua was born, The new pope turned 1,779 weeks old. And again, he has the same birth date as the poem that contains the lyrics of our national anthem. Now, you'll notice the date September 14th. In most parts of the world, this is written as 14/9. 149 is the gematria of Skull and Bones, Skull and Crossbones Society, and Yale Skull and Crossbones Secret Society, all with 149 gematria. Even the founder of the society, William Huntington Russell, 1049. In fact, Yale Skull and Crossbones Secret Society also matches Joshua's full name in ordinal. But when we talk about the Skull and Bones code, we typically talk about the numbers 223 and 322. Of course, the 322 is on the emblem, whereas Skull and Crossbones gives us the number 223. And there's so much connections to the 223, 322. I dedicated a whole post to it. Back in the year 2023, Yale University turned 322 years old. And this date, October 9th of 2023, is what brings us to the most interesting part of this riddle. As if you measure from this date to the date of Joshua's crash, you get 2 years, 2 months, and 3 weeks exactly. And that is also a number connected to the Star-Spangled Banner, which equals 223 in the alphabetic order. The Star-Spangled Banner was written during the War of 1812. And when you write out War of 1812, it also sums to 223. Now, another thing I wanted to point out is the reverse value of the Star-Spangled Banner. If you flip the order of the alphabet backwards, so that Z is 1 and A is 26, this cipher called reverse ordinal gematria, the Star-Spangled Banner equals 344. And check this out. If you measure from the date that the Star-Spangled Banner was adopted as America's national anthem back in 1931 to the birth of the new pope, he was born 34,400 days after the adoption of the anthem. And not only does the Star-Spangled Banner have that sum, but so does Yale's Skull and Crossbones with capital letters and American Pope in Latin, 344. One of the most interesting tidbits about the Star-Spangled Banner, however, is its Latin gematria of 666. And this is the next number I want to talk about. Because the man that Anthony Joshua just fought in the boxing ring, Jake Paul, he was born on January 17th of 1997. That date was 66,600 days after Francis Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. The name Francis Key also sums to 666 in our significant Sumerian cipher, which multiplies the alphabetic order by 6. And just hours after the Paul-Joshua fight ended, Pope Leo turned 25,666 days of age. He was also 3,666 weeks old. Those 4 digits are the exact same 4 numbers found in Joshua's age for the fight, as he was a span of 36 years and 66 days old for the match. That match was also 89,990 days after the birth of Francis Scott Key, which has the upside down 666. Now, the day after the crash, or maybe even the same day, the granddaughter of John F. Kennedy, named Tatiana Schlossberg, died of cancer. And on December 29th, look how old John F. Kennedy was, or would have been. Exactly 5,666 weeks old for the crash. And in reverse Sumerian, the name Kennedy equals 666, which is also the value of Brotherhood of Death with all the base ciphers added. The Brotherhood of Death, the nickname for the Skull and Bone Society. And when you add up the Gematria in all four methods, Brotherhood of Death, 666. So already this comes together quite well, doesn't it? Now, the Pope is also called the Pontiff. And this is a pretty intriguing word. The name Pontiff comes from Latin pontifex, which means bridge builder. When Pope Leo became the Pontiff, it was 86 days before the birthday of Francis Scott Key, matching the ordinal value of Pontiff. In 2024, the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed on March 26th, which was the 86th day of a leap year. Notice how Key Bridge equals 86 in ordinal. Well, the crash involving Anthony Joshua happened on a date with primary numerology of 86. And using capital letters, his full name equals 860. Think about how the term 86 is used for offing or throwing something out. The phrase human sacrifice sums to 86, just like blood sacrifice. But these two phrases also sum to 76 with the single reduction method. This is the next number I want to touch on because Skull and Bones and Secret Society both also equal 76. Remember, the president, who was a member of Skull and Bones, George W. Bush, was born on July 6th, or 7-6. Our new American Pope, Robert Prevost, his name equals 76. Not only was Anthony Joshua born 76 days after Francis Scott Key's birthday, but Key would have been 76,776 days old when he was born, reminding us that the United States was founded in 1776. The crash on December 29th was even a span of 76 days after Anthony's birthday. 10 days earlier, he squared off with Jake Paul on a date with primary numerology of 76. The name Paul equals 76, just like the word fight. This using capital letters, adding 26 for every one in the phrase. December 29th, when Anthony's trainers were killed, that crash was a span of 188 days before July 4th. 188 is the ordinal gematria of Francis Scott Key. And he was the one who coined that the banner, our flag, was Star-Spangled, which has double gematria of 188. When the Francis Scott Key Bridge first opened, back in the year 1977, it was 72,188 days after Francis Scott Key was born. And when Yale University had its special birthday back in 2023, it was 89,188 days after Key was born. We're also going to talk about how this story all syncs up with the two Great American Total Solar Eclipses, which created an X over the United States, very similar to the bones crossed behind the skull. The number 188 appears in the number of days between Key's death and that second eclipse. Boxer Jake Paul was even 2,188 months, or born that number of months after the writing of the national anthem. And don't you think it's kind of confusing that Jake Paul is a professional boxer? Because he's not very good. I would actually say he fucking sucks. He hasn't been able to deliver any type of entertainment in these matches. But it doesn't matter, because the people in charge of these fights, organizing everything, control society and essentially move the money around. Notice how the name boxer equals 437 like Jake Paul. And again, he's placed in this role as a form of ritual. I mean, remember, think about how they said 33 million people watched that fight on Netflix. 33? Really? Do you believe that? This 188 number brings us to the next part of this riddle. The 188th prime number, again, that being the value of Francis Scott Key, is 1123. Francis Scott Key was born 1,123 days after American independence. And he would go on to write the national anthem, which equals 1123. This trigonal cipher is the same cipher that Anthony Joshua matches Star-Spangled Banner. When the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore opened, it was exactly 1,123 weeks after Pope Leo was born. Again, all of these people scripted to be in their positions of power decades in advance. The Paul Joshua fight was 11,023 weeks after the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And if you count the number of days from Independence Day to Joshua's car crash, you get 91,123 days. Now, there's a few more notes connected to the number 13 in my post, which you can find linked below in the description. But next up, I want to talk about the Skull and Bones code, as this was one of the easiest Skull and Bones riddles you will ever see. We start with the number 201, which is, of course, very significant to the Catholic Church, who lost their Pope Jorge Mario Bergoglio, whose name equals 2001. He was the first ever pope from the Jesuit order, and he lived in Suite 201 at the Domus Sanctae Marthae, which is another 201. The phrase eclipse code is 201, so is eclipse ritual. Skull and Bones also equals 201, as does Skull and Crossbones. This is one of those numbers that ties these societies together. The 201st prime number is 1229. And 1229, or December 29th, was the date of Anthony Joshua's crash in Nigeria. 1229 is also the Latin value of Skull and Bones Society. And in fact, the boxer was even born 12 years and 29 weeks after the opening of the Key Bridge in Baltimore. Anthony's crash was on a date with numerology of 66. The number 66 has the same gematria as Skull and Bones. It's also the product of 3 times 22. But notice the standard English gematria of 66. These are the same 4 digits as the year 1832, which is when Skull and Bones was founded. Francis Scott Key was 1,832 weeks old when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. We're told that Skull and Bones was formed in December of 1832. Now, you can't find an exact date, but if you look at the first day of December 1832 to the date of Anthony's car crash, it was 70,520 days later. This number reduces to 752 in numerology, which is the standard gematria of Skull and Bones. Now, back to this number 223. The Star-Spangled Banner and War of 1812 both equal 223. By the way, the fact that the United States had a war in 1812 is pretty interesting, because when the country declared independence in 1776, check out the number of the brown lunation. It was negative 1812. Every year since 1923, the lunation number has been counted, but there's more to it. If you go backwards negative, you'll often find very relevant numbers. Anthony Paul's fight with Anthony Paul. You know, there's so many first names in this match. Jake, Paul, Anthony, Joshua. It's like these names are supposed to be mixed up, right? So anyway, Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua. This match was 20 months and 23 days after the collapse of the Key Bridge in Baltimore. It was also 2 months and 23 days before the date the bridge opened. I guess that's the 29th, so that would have been the car crash. Well, in Gematria, the name Anthony Joshua equals 223 with capital letters, and his first name, Anthony, is 322 in primes. The 2 trainers who died in the crash were named Latz Iodelli, which equals 223 reverse caps, and Sinagami, which equals 322. Both of them were trainers, which equals 223. And I didn't have this in the post because I didn't see the name yet, but now, look at the name of the man accused of a crime in the accident. His name is Adenei Coyote, which equals 223 in reverse. And like I said earlier, this crash was exactly 2 years, 2 months, 3 weeks after Yale turned 322 in 2023. But this isn't the only important number to be drawn from this, because this was also 26 months and 3 weeks. So this gives us the number 263. Order of the Skull and Bones and Skull and Crossbones, both 263. The crash was exactly 2,263 lunations after Francis Scott Key died. Skull and Bones was formed 20,603 days after American independence. The Francis Scott Key Bridge opened 263 days after Independence Day. And then it was destroyed on the 26th of March, or 26/3. This all matches the name of the new bridge builder, or Pope of the Catholic Church, Robert Francis Prevost, whose name equals 263 in ordinal. When Yale turned 322 years old in 2023, Jake Paul was a span of 320 months and 23 days old. 3-2-2-2-2-3. Last year's total eclipse was 2 months, 23 days after his birthday. Both 223 and 322 sum to 295 in the alphabetic order, like Skull and Bone Society reverse. Jake Paul was born 295 years after Yale's founding. The name Francis Scott Key also 295. Now, in the reverse alphabetic order, the numbers 223 and 322 equal 334. The car crash was 33 weeks and 4 days after Leo XIV became the Pope. Francis Scott Key Bridge has matching 334 Gematria with John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who I pointed out is connected to this through the number 666. The numbers 223 and 322 also sum to 813 in the Fibonacci cipher. This crash was 8 years, 130 days after the first Great American Eclipse. It was also a span of 813 days after Yale's Skull and Bones anniversary. The numbers 223 and 322 also both equal 116. Bridge Builder and American Pope, both 116. Joshua's crash was also exactly 116 weeks after Yale's Skull and Bones anniversary. Also 9 months, 11 days before their next anniversary. Car crash equals 116. And it took the United States 116 years to adopt the national anthem. Now, another reason these two total solar eclipses over the United States were so significant is because the second one passed directly over the city of Cleveland, Ohio. And Cleveland, Ohio is the birthplace of boxer Jake Paul. I think of Jake and Logan Paul as kind of like the grunt workers of the elite class, right? Guys who are certainly connected to these societies. Their fame was not entirely organic, but they'll also take a broken jaw, right? I mean, Jake Paul got his face lit up in that fight, which I, and I'm sure a lot of others, enjoyed seeing a little bit. Now, notice how his name, Jake Joseph Paul, equals 900 in Sumerian. This is like the ordinal value of the moon, which equals 90. The day named after the moon is Monday, which also equals 90, like Yale Skull and Bone Society. And both of these eclipses happened on a Monday, and Anthony Joshua's crash was also on a Monday. That crash was exactly 90,000 days after the birth of Francis Scott Key. The fight against Jake Paul was 90 weeks after the Key Bridge collapsed. Joshua's car crash was exactly 90 weeks after the second Great American Eclipse. That's also 630 days, and the crash was in Lagos, Nigeria, which shares a 63 value with Nigeria, and Anthony Joshua, 63 in 2 reduction ciphers. Now, you can take this a step further. The 90th prime number is 463, and that's the Latin value of total eclipse. The Key Bridge opened exactly 46 years and 3 weeks after the Key written national anthem was adopted. Also, in regards to Key and the name Francis, don't forget that the papacy is symbolized by the key, right? The Vatican's keys and their symbols. You can see this perhaps a little more clearly in the Vatican symbolism with the crossed keys, kind of like the cross bones, right? Not that dissimilar. The Brotherhood of Death sums to 220, like Skull and Bones 202, Total Solar Eclipse 202. Anthony's December 29th crash was 2 months and 20 days after Yale's anniversary, but this is also 11 weeks and 5 days. Skull and Crossbones, Skull and Bones Society, Masonic killing, all connecting to 115. Jake Paul has that 115 birth numerology. Talked about this number a lot in my last video. Joshua's crash was a span of 631 days after the second eclipse. That's the 115th prime number. 20 months and 22 days, Skull and Bones, right? So we've explored enough, but let me just go over a few more things to help solidify this riddle before I wrap this up. Yale University was founded in the year 1701. And notice how these digits are significant to this story, right? Jake Joseph Paul, his full name. This sums to 1710 in Latin. Anthony Joshua is 171 ordinal. One of the crash victims, Latz Ayodele, 171. He died in Nigeria, 171. In a car accident, 1071. Both car crash and crash, 171. Yale's Skull and Bones anniversary was 17,001 day after the Key Bridge opened. Again, the school founded in 1701. But what's cool about this is that these are the same 3 digits found in the double value of bridge, 117 standard and reverse. Lagos, Nigeria equals 117, so does accident and boxing. This crash was 643 days after the bridge collapse, and that's the 117th prime number. Now, 643 days is also a span of exactly 92 weeks. Anthony equals 92, so does the date December 29th. Key Bridge collapse and War of 1812 give us 92 as well. But the 92nd prime number is 479. Skull and Bones was founded 47,900 days after Yale University was formed. And isn't it interesting because the name Joshua has matching 479 Gematria in standard with Prevost, the new pope's name. In fact, Joshua and Skull and Bones also share in 1192. And this all goes back to Joshua's date of birth. He was born less than a week after Yale turned 288 years old. And he was born on the 288th day of the year, which matches Yale's Skull and Bone Society in ordinal. This 288 is also significant to the Pope, who was born in Chicago, Illinois, both 288. Joshua was even 426 lunar phases old for the Key Bridge collapse exactly. That's the Latin value of Yale. Finally, I want to look at the phrase Brotherhood of Death once again. Brotherhood of Death and Total Eclipse both equal 187, which is like the homicide code. Joshua's fatal car crash was exactly 108 years and 7 months after JFK was born. That's also 1,303 months. And that stood out because that's the birth numerology of Joshua. The words collapse and president both equal 133. Bridge collapse, right? But in the reverse order, the Brotherhood of Death and Skull and Bone Society both equal 347. And check this out. Joshua's crash was not only 347 months after Jake Paul was born, but Paul was also 347 days after his birthday. The match between the two men and Joshua's crash were both 3,047 lunar phases after the birth of Francis Scott Key. Key died 3,470 weeks after American independence and 10,347 days after he wrote the national anthem. Anthony Joshua and Jake Paul were born exactly 97 sidereal months apart from one another. A sidereal month measuring an orbit of the moon in relation to the stars. Well, 97, like Skull and Crossbones, Brotherhood of Death, Death, all 97. Our new American Pope was born on a date with 97 numerology. And think about how December 29th was the date of the car crash. All of these equal 97, and so do the name of the two victims. Latif Ayadeli and Sinagami, both 97 in Gematria. There's just more Skull and Bones connections between the Pope, Anthony Joshua, Jake Paul, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It just goes on and on, but the last part I want to talk about is the Jesus code. Because the name Joshua is the anglicized version of the Hebrew name of Jesus, Yeshua. Now, most people with the name Anthony go by Tony. I point this out because both Tony and Joshua equals 74 in the alphabetic order. And 74 is the big Jesus number. Jesus and Jesus Christ, both 74, like killing. Cross 74, right? The crucifixion told in the Gospels, another 74. And in Latin, total solar eclipse equals 704. An eclipse is essentially symbolic of the crucifixion, as during the Gospels, 3 of them speak of darkness falling over the sky during the daytime as the crucifixion took place. And as this art symbolizes, this is connected to the eclipse code. The Francis Scott Key Bridge came down on a date with 74 numerology. Skull and Bone Society, Masonic, more 74s. The crash was a span of 11 days after the Paul fight, which is Jesus in reduction. Jesus also equals 515. And notice how the Pope was born 51,500 days after the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And now he leads the Catholic Church, which believes in Jesus. His birth was also exactly 141 years after the poem was written. Prevost and Catholic, both 141 with capital letters. Key Bridge collapse shares 290 gematria with War of 1812. This is a number connected to Jesus Christ. Jesus equals 29, Christ is 290, and Jesus Christ is 290. And remember, we have a president who was born during Brown Lunation 290. And his name, Donald Trump, matches Jesus 589, 985. Anyway, this crash was 290 days before Joshua's next birthday, and the names Anthony and Joshua both equal 29. The phrase crucifixion of Jesus has matching 226 gematria with sacrifice. And this stood out because the crash was 226 days before the 2026 total solar eclipse. Their boxing match was 226 days into Leo's papacy. Joshua was born 226 days after the date the national anthem was adopted. And of course, 226 days, that's 32 weeks and 2 days. So if you want to check out my video on the Key Bridge collapse, that's linked down below in the description. I talked about how it was all connected to Francis Scott Key and the papacy. But this was all before we knew that the next pope would be from the United States. And, you know, a lot of numbers I talked about in this video are relevant to the papacy. And I just want to shout out the chat real quick for bringing this up. I was glancing at it while I was doing this video. But this bridge collapsed at 1:28 in the morning. And 128 is a number that we've been connecting to bridge collapses for years. I believe it was 2022 or maybe 2021. We had the Frick Park Bridge collapse in Pennsylvania. That was on the date January 28th or 128. Bridge collapse equals 128, so does Frick. Now, last year's collapse, or the one in 2024, was in Maryland, which equals 128. And that was 128 days before the birthday of Francis Scott Key. The mayor of Baltimore took office on 12/8, December 8th. The Key Bridge collapse was also 128 days after Biden's birthday. And think about how Brotherhood equals 128. The last pope was born in Buenos Aires, another 128. And even that, I was connecting to the Star-Spangled Banner. So if you missed that video, check it out. It's one of my more solid, intriguing videos, I think. There was one more I listed in the description. If I could quickly figure out which one that was. Sorry, YouTube made it like really difficult to edit my videos while I'm live. I don't know how to access the panel anymore. Huh. Well, anyway. Oh, it was the other Jake Paul fight against Mike Tyson. That's the one I was thinking about. So in 2024, Jake Paul and Mike Tyson were originally scheduled to fight on the anniversary of the moon landing, but then it got delayed 4 months. So the video I did on the numerology of that fight is also listed below, as it was all connected to the moon landing. All right, everybody, that'll do it for this video. Thanks for tuning in. Do feel free to like, share, subscribe, all that goody good YouTube stuff we creators appreciate. If you'd really like to support the work, check out gematrinator.com and become a member, which helps keep this content rolling, keeps the website online, and helps other creators continue creating as well. Peace, love, God bless. We'll talk to y'all next time. See ya.